This is part 2 of Neuroscience and Biological Foundations. Alright, so here we're going to take a look at how poison and drugs affects our brains as well as our bodies. We'll be talking about foreign chemicals like the teratogens or the poisons and drugs and how it can mimic and block ongoing actions of neurotransmitters that, would interfere with our normal functioning. Think about snake venom or some other poisons like Botox. Okay, Botox can, as well as the snake venom, seriously can affect normal muscle contraction. And the funny thing is, these same poisons are sometimes used to be able to treat certain medical conditions that involves abnormal muscle contraction, as well as being used for cosmetic purposes. Think about Botox. You hear how they utilize Botox. Uh, some people might have it applied within their lips to give fuller lips, or within their cheeks, or to help their rear ends, um, or the gluteus maximus. Excuse me. Always want to laugh when I say it that way. However, it's also been used as far as helping with pain relief. Most recently, they've started using Botox to help individuals that suffer from migraine headaches. Now, just want to take a look at pretty much on this slide, it shows you how normal transmission for neurotransmitters occur, as well as what happens when poison and drugs affects the neurotransmitters. Take a look for our normal neurotransmitter activation. What happens is you look within the postsynaptic receptor site. There's going to be a way it fits like a key, and it fits within. Okay, goes down into that nerve impulse, which is also when we talk about the neuron impulse, we're talking about action potentials. It's going to the neuron receives this information. The dendrites will then recognize that neurotransmitter by the particular shape. And that shape of the neurotransmitter will basically match the shape of whatever receptor site is where the message is going to. Now, when it's talking about blocking neurotransmitter activation, here as you look at the slide, it's without the correct shape. So it's not going to fit in, and it's kind of being blocked. It's not going to stimulate the dendrites. It's not going to move down the axon, and that message will basically be blocked off. Think of it as if we get a call from an unknown caller, and that call comes in. You can, in the future, stop that call by going into your phone and clicking on block the call. Same type of instance. Now, when we're talking about the poison as well as drug effects, agonist type drugs, they're like the poison that's within the spider, the black widow spider that they speak of. Or if a person ingests nicotine from smoking, there's enough of a structure that it'll mimic, okay? It can mimic the effects of that neuron, thus it's going to send a message. So you notice that that shape is similar. Now, antagonist type of drugs actually can block neurotransmitters, like if we talk about acetylcholine in terms for muscle actions, it blocks it, therefore it paralyzes our muscle structure. Okay, that drug will go in, is going to have that same shape, is going to sit there, and any type of neurotransmitters that try to go through will not make it in because of what? A blockage of the area. All right, so what we're going to be moving into now is looking at the central nervous system as well as the peripheral nervous system and how it's organized. Have you heard the expression information is power? Well, nowhere is this truer than within the human body. Because without information, we wouldn't be able to survive. Neurons is within our nervous system, and it must take in sensory information from the environment, and then it'll decide what to do with the information. So just as the circulatory system handles our blood, which will then convey chemicals and oxygen, our nervous system will use chemicals as well as electrical processes to help convey the information. The nervous system is divided and subdivided into several different branches. Okay, the main branch is going to include the brain, and is also going to include a bundle of nerves that forms the spinal cord. Because the system is located within the center of your body, and that's between the skull and the spine, it's pretty much going to be called the central nervous system. And it's primarily responsible for processing and organizing information. Now, the second major branch of our nervous system includes all the nerves that's going to be outside of the brain as well as the spinal cord. This is our peripheral nervous system. Here, messages are going to be carried, those messages being action potentials, and it goes to and from the central nervous system to the periphery of our body. So if we take a closer look at the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, you can see the breakdown. Take a look at this slide here. It's listed how the central nervous system is going to be broken down. It directs these mental and basic life processes, that being how we think, how we feel, what we feel as far as tactile. That information goes to the spinal cord. It'll send that information from the brain to the peripheral nervous system, as it also helps to control our reflexes. The brain will then direct these mental processes and help to maintain our functioning, that being how we breathe, our heart rate, those sort of things. If you notice, it breaks down specifically which parts of the brain is going to be definitely a part of the process, that being the forebrain, the midbrain, the hindbrain, reticular formation, the pons, cerebral cortex, as well as the limbic system, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the medulla, and the cerebellum. Now, if you move over to the other side and look at the peripheral nervous system, this is what carries information from the central nervous system. And it's broken down into two more systems, that being the somatic nervous system, which is our voluntary controls, and then the involuntary controls, which is from the autonomic nervous system. Now, the central nervous system is the branch of the nervous system that makes us unique from one another and from other species. Most other animals can smell, they can run, they can see, hear, much more better than we can. But thanks to our central nervous system, we pretty much can process information as well as adapt to the environment in ways that no other species can. The thing is, though, our central nervous system is so fragile and delicate. And unlike neurons within the peripheral nervous system that can actually regenerate, think back to those questions that was at the beginning of the chapter, and it requires less protection, there's serious damage to neurons in it that happens in the central nervous system is usually going to be permanent. Now, with that being said, the brain may not be as hardwired as we used to think as in the past. So let's look at the flexible brain and how it reacts and works with the central nervous system. Our brain changes structure and function. So first, let's take a look at neuroplasticity. Rather than this being something fixed or as a solid organ, the brain is capable of changing its structure as well as function as a result of the usage of our experiences. The rewiring is what makes our brains so adaptive. For example, it makes it possible for us to be able to learn a new sport or to be able to learn a new language. The great thing about it is this rewiring has even helped us to remodel the brain after someone had a stroke, for example. Uh, Edward Taub, who was a psychologist along with his colleagues as early as 2002, had a lot of success working with patients who had strokes. Now, neurogenesis and stem cells. Our brains, it continuously replace lost cells with new cells that would originate deep within the brain and then migrate to become part of its circuitry. The source for these newly created cells is a neural stem cell, the rare immature cells that can grow and develop into any type of cell. Their fate actually depends on the chemical signals that they would receive. Stem cells have been used for bone marrow transplants, and there's been clinical trials using stem cells to repopulate or even replace cells that's been devastated through injuries or disease. And it's been able to help patients suffering from strokes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, epilepsy, stress, as well as depression. So the good news about stem cells is that it can help to develop into any kind of cell or tissue. Now, of course, with good news, there's bad news. The bad news is, though, is that scientists, they are having trouble being able to make them grow into the kind of cells that they would like for them to grow. Now, how do the spinal reflex work? The spinal cord, beginning at the base of the brain and continuing down the back, the spinal cord carries vital information from the rest of the body that's into and then out of the brain. But the spinal cord doesn't simply relay messages. It can also initiate automatic behaviors all on its own. We call this involuntary automatic behaviors. Those reflexes or reflex arcs, because of the response to the incoming stimuli, is automatically going to be reflected back. We're all born with numerous reflexes, many of which will fade over time. But even as adults, we can still blink in response to a puff of the air in the eye, or you might hear me coughing, or you might gag when something touches the back of your throat, or you become dry from speaking too much. In terms of other areas, urination and defecation is response to pressure within the bladder as well as the rectum. Reflexes even would influence our sexual responses. There are certain stimuli, such as the stroking of the genitals, that can lead to an arousal as well as the reflexive muscle contractions of an orgasm in both men and women. But in order for them to have the passion, thoughts, and emotion that we would normally associate with sex, the sensory information from the stroking and orgasm really has to be carried to the brain. So now let's take a closer look at the peripheral nervous system. This is what connects the central nervous system to the body. First up, the somatic nervous system. This is a subdivision of the peripheral nervous system that's going to connect the sensory receptors and control skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system is a subdivision of the peripheral nervous system that controls involuntary functions. This includes how our heart rate would be, as well as our digestion. We can further see the subdivide into the sympathetic nervous system, which would work toward arousal, and the parasympathetic nervous system that helps to calm. The sympathetic nervous system is a subdivision of the autonomic nervous system. Its responsibilities include arousing the body and mobilizing it for energy during times of stress. We can think of it in the terms of fight or flight. The parasympathetic nervous system is that subdivision that's responsible for calming the body and conserving energy. Now, when we speak about the sympathetic nervous system, it provides an adaptive evolutionary type of advantage. At the beginning of human evolution, when we faced a dangerous bear or even someone violently aggressive, there were only two reasonable responses, that being fight or flight. The autonomic mobilization of bodily resources can still be critical even in modern times today, yet less life-threatening. They could be included in events such as traffic jams, or it might activate our sympathetic nervous system. Our body's still going to respond to these sources of stress with that sympathetic arousal. As we continue learning and going through this chapter and even moving toward the next chapter, it's going to continue to be able to discuss how the sympathetic system would respond to chronic daily stress, as well as how it can become detrimental to our health. But we'll talk about that in the next chapter. Now, when we begin our exploration of the brain at the lower end, where the spinal cord joins to the base of the brain and then move upward through the skull, as we move from the bottom to the top, or lower basic processes, this would be like breathing. It generally gives way to more complex mental processes. The lower level brain structure would include the brain size as well as the complexity of varying significant type of species to species. So, for example, if we looked at how fish and reptiles, they'll have smaller, less complex brains than do cats and dogs. The most complex brain would actually belong to whales, dolphins, as well as higher primates such as chimpanzees, gorillas, as well as we humans. Now, there's billions of neurons that would make up the human brain, and it control much of what we think, how we feel, and what we do, the actions we take. There's going to be certain brain structures that specialize to perform certain tasks. This is a process that's known as a localization of function. However, most parts of the brain is going to perform integrating overlapping functions, as I mentioned earlier. Now, you heard me mention REM, or rapid eye movement, earlier. So think of it like this. You're in a deep REM sleep as you begin your last dream of the night. And we'll break this down and know how to do all that in the future chapter. But for now, let me keep your attention with this. You're at that deep part, dreaming. Your vital signs is going to start to increase as the dream gets more exciting. But then you sleep and you dream. And they're shattered by this buzzing alarm clock saying, hey, it's time to get up. All of your automatic behaviors and survival responses within that scenario is going to be controlled or influenced by parts of the hindbrain. Your hindbrain includes the medulla as well as the pons and the cerebellum. The medulla is essentially an extension of the spinal cord with many nerve fibers that's passing through it, which carries the information to and from the brain. It's also responsible for that automatic bodily functions like respiration and heart rate. Now, the pons, this involves with respiration. It helps with movement, sleeping, waking, as well as dreaming. And that's not the only things. There's other things as well. But it contains axons that cross from one side of the brain to the other. Think of it like this, and it is the Latin word. Pons is a Latin word for bridge. So the pons kind of bridge all our information through those axons together. Now the cerebellum, which is a cauliflower shape, is considered a little brain when you speak of it in Latin. Evolutionary, this is what we consider the old structure. It contains fine muscle movement as well as balance. Researchers have seen this used in functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, and it's known for it's been able to show parts of the cerebellum being important for our memory, sensory, our being able to perceive, perceptual, cognitive, our language as well as learning. So it's got a lot of important factors that it is involved with. Moving to the midbrain. The midbrain helps us to orient our eye and body movements. This is that hand-eye coordination, you could think of it as, but it helps with those movements for visual as well as auditory stimuli. And it works with the pons to kind of help control sleep as well as our level of arousal. It also contains a small structure that's involved with the neurotransmitter dopamine that, when there's deterioration, demonstrates and shows Parkinson's disease. When we're running through the core of the hindbrain and the midbrain as well as the brainstem, this is that reticular formation. It's a little tiny thing, but this diffuse finger-shaped network of neurons actually helps screen incoming sensory information. It allows for alerts to the higher brain to center important events. Without this reticular formation, you would not be alert or even conscious. Now let's take a look at the forebrain. First up, the thalamus. Excuse me. When we're talking about the forebrain, here consider it to be the switchboard of relaying sensory messages. That's from to the cerebral cortex. Okay, so I mentioned the thalamus, but let's actually talk about the hypothalamus. Here, this is a small brain structure that's beneath the thalamus, and it helps govern our drives, that being thirst, hunger, our sex arousal, whether we have aggressive behaviors, as well as hormones. Within the limbic system, it's an interconnected group of the forebrain structure, and it involves our emotions, our drives, as well as our memory. The cerebral cortex, that's going to be a thin layer on the cerebral hemispheres, and it regulates complex behavior, including our sensations, our motor control, as well as higher mental processes. And although the cerebral cortex is only about 1/8 of an inch thick, yeah, it's actually made up of approximately 30 billion neurons, and it's 9 times as many glial cells. So it contains numerous wrinkles. That's where those wrinkles you see in the brains coming in, okay, which is called convolutions. This increases the surface area while allowing it to also fit within the restricted space of the skull. The full cerebral cortex, as well as the 2 cerebral hemispheres beneath it, closely would resemble a walnut. The division, or the fissure, which is what it is actually called, is down the center and marks the left and right hemisphere. And it makes up about 80% of the brain's weight. They're mostly filled with axon connections between the cortex and the other type of brain structures. Each hemisphere will control the opposite side of the body. Okay, so your left hemisphere actually handles the right side of your body, where the right hemisphere actually handles the left. So as I'm waving to you with my left hand, it's actually my right hemisphere within the brain telling my hand to do the movement, my left hand to do that movement. Now, if we take a deeper look at the limbic system, it's generally responsible, as I mentioned, for our emotions, our drives, and memory. However, the major focus of interest in the limbic system, and particularly the amygdala, has been its production and regulation for aggression as well as fear. Another well-known function of the limbic system would be the role as in terms of receiving pleasure or reward. Now, even though the limbic system structures and neurotransmitters are instrumental in emotions, the frontal lobes of the cortex is an extremely important part. Okay? I'm sorry, excuse me. I'm going to stop and take a sip. A little liquid hopefully will clear that throat that from me having to keep stopping. Now, looking at the slide, as I mentioned, the hypothalamus is the small structure, helps to govern hunger, thirst, sex, and aggression. Also within the limbic system, we have the hippocampus, and this is involved also with forming and retrieving our memories. As mentioned earlier with the limbic system, the amygdala, here is more of the regulations of our emotions, for example, if we speak about fear as well as aggression. So now we're going to take a look at the major functions of the lobes of the brain. The cerebral hemispheres is divided within 8 distinct areas, or what we call lobes. There are 4 in each hemisphere. Like the lower level brain structures, each lobe specializes in somewhat different tasks. This here is another example of localization of function. However, there are some functions, again, that's going to overlap between the lobes. So, let's look at the frontal lobes. The large frontal lobes will coordinate messages that's received from the other 3 lobes. I call this the executive, okay? The executive functioning. There's an area, though, at the back of the frontal lobes that's known as the motor cortex. And what it does is instigate all the voluntary type of movements, like me doing my wave right now with the hand. In the lower left frontal lobe lies the Broca's area. Now, Broca is a term that came from Paul Broca back in 1865, who discovered that damage to this area actually causes difficulty with speech, but it doesn't damage your language comprehension. In terms of language comprehension and any type of impaired abilities, that's actually known as the Broca's aphasia, okay, which is located in the Broca's area. Last thing I want to just say is that the frontal lobes controls most higher functioning that distinguish humans from other animals. It helps with the responsibility of our way of thinking, our personality, how those traits are, emotions, as well as memory. Any type of abnormalities that's found within the frontal lobes are often observed in patients such as that have schizophrenia, as well as there's other research that has indicated that damage to the frontal lobe would affect personality, motivation, our drives, our level of creativity, our level of self-awareness, initiative, reasoning, as well as our emotional behaviors. Now, when we talk about the parietal lobes, excuse me, here we're talking about how it receives and interprets bodily sensations, this being with pressure, pain, touch, temperature, as well as localization of our body parts. So there's a band of tissue on the front of the parietal lobe that's called the somatosensory cortex. And this basically receives information about touch that's within different body areas. These areas of the body that has more somatosensory as well as motor cortex devoted to them, such as our hands and face, are going to be more sensitive to touch, and they'll have the most precise motor control. Now, temporal lobes. Temporal lobes are going to be responsible for our hearing, our ability to comprehend language, our memory, as well as some emotional control. The auditory cortex, which helps with sound, will be located at the top of each temporal lobe. And these area processes incoming sensory information, and it'll send it to the parietal lobes, which will then combine it with other sensory information. There's an area of the left temporal lobe, which is called the Wernicke's area. Okay, this is involved with our language comprehension. After Broca discovered the area, there was a German neurologist called Karl Wernicke, and he noted that patients with damage within this area really couldn't understand what they read or what they heard, but they could speak quickly and easily. However, their speech was often unintelligible, and that's because it contained a lot of word soup, basically, a bunch of made up words, sound substitutions, as well as word substitution. This syndrome is known as Wernicke's aphasia. When we're talking about the occipital lobes, this is responsible, among other things, for our vision as well as our visual perception. So damage to the occipital lobe can produce blindness. Even though the eyes and their natural connection to the brain can be perfectly healthy, if there's damage within that area, then a person can deem and believe that they're blind. Now, there are what we also call association areas. And one of the most popular myths in psychology is that we only use 10% of our brain. Yeah, this is a myth, folks. Because this myth is probably started with early research showing that only 3/4 of the cortex is uncommitted, with no precise or specific function responsive to electrical brain stimulation. Now, these areas are really dormant. They're dormant. They're not dormant. But however, they are clearly involved with how we interpret, our integrations, as well as acting on information that's possessed by other parts of the brain. So they're called association areas because they associate or they may connect various areas and functions of the brain. The association areas within the frontal lobe, for example, would help with our decision making and planning processes. Similarly, the association area right in front of the motor cortex, it can be involved with planning of how we might voluntarily move. Think about when you go to do exercise and you plan to ride a bike. That's when those association areas could be of assistance. Now, I love this slide because it gives you an idea of how the brain works with our body by demonstrating it graphically what parts of the body is connected with the brain. Okay, so it represents a vertical cross that will be taken from the left hemisphere's motor cortex and the right hemisphere's somatosensory cortex. So if body areas were truly proportional to the amount of tissue on the motor and somatosensory corticals, our bodies would kind of look like this odd-shaped human that's draped around the outside of the cortex. And I am going to end here. This is the end of part 2, and we will get back together for part 3.